The world had been holding its breath for months. Underneath the Swiss Alps, hidden beneath the rock and ice of an ancient mountain range, the last bastion of humanity's resistance pulsed with life. Inside the hearth, a heavily fortified underground command center, Captain Evelyn Carter stood at the epicenter of Earth's survival. Her fingers hovered above the controls of a terminal, eyes scanning the holographic display as she watched the fleet of invaders slowly eclipse Earth's sky. The Vortherans were near. Their fleet, a vast armada of warships, was on a collision course with Earth. With every passing hour, the enemy grew closer, their presence growing darker, a reminder of the inevitable end that seemed certain. Eve had watched the first waves of destruction. Cities crumbled. Families were torn apart. But she wasn't here to mourn. She was here to fight. Eve had no grand speeches, no rallying cries. She didn't need them. The future of the human race depended on one thing: cleverness. And that was where Eve excelled. "Status report, Commander?" Eve's voice broke the silence. Her tone was clipped, professional. Commander Holt, a burly man with a face weathered by years of war, stepped forward. His eyes were tired, but they held no doubt. The fleet's trajectory remains unchanged. If they continue at this pace, they'll reach Earth within 3 days. We're getting ready, but, he trailed off, unsure how to finish the thought. The human forces were already stretched thin, and the idea of holding off the Vortherans for much longer seemed impossible. Eve didn't need to hear the rest. She had known this was coming. The Vortherans were too powerful, their technology far beyond anything humanity had ever known. The odds were stacked against them. But there was something they didn't know, something they would never anticipate. "We have no time for hesitation," Eve said, her voice steady as stone. "Prepare the operation. We're going to make them underestimate us. It's our only chance." She turned back to the display, her fingers dancing across the terminal. The room was filled with the soft hum of machinery and the quiet murmur of soldiers preparing for what they feared would be the final battle. But Eve's mind was already elsewhere, laying the groundwork for a deception that would change the course of this war. She watched as the hologram of the Vortheran fleet moved closer to Earth, a sea of ships floating like vultures over a dying carcass. The human fleet, what was left of it, seemed so small in comparison. Yet Eve wasn't worried. She had faced impossible odds before, and this time, she was betting on something that no one else had considered. The Vortherans were arrogant. Overconfident. They had swept through countless worlds, effortlessly crushing civilizations that had tried to resist them. They believed that Earth would be no different. That belief was their greatest weakness. A plan began to take shape in Eve's mind, a series of well-timed moves that would make the Vortherans believe humanity had something more than just stubbornness to offer. Eve had studied their every move, their every tactic. And in the silence of the hearth, she made her move. "Commander Holt," Eve said, her voice sharp with authority. "Get the team. We're going to leak false information, strategic intel that will make the Vortherans think we've developed a new weapon. I want them to believe that this new weapon is capable of taking out their fleet in a single strike. It's the perfect bait." Holt blinked, then nodded slowly. "A weapon? But we don't." "We don't need to have one," Eve interrupted. "We just need them to think we do. The Vortherans have been relying on their superior firepower for too long. Let's give them something to fear, something that'll make them second-guess every move they make." The tension in the room grew palpable as Eve's plan began to take shape. It was a dangerous gamble. If they failed, the Vortherans would annihilate them without hesitation. But if they succeeded, it would shake the invaders' confidence and buy humanity the time it so desperately needed. "We're not lying to them," Eve continued, her voice cold and calculated. "We're giving them the truth they fear. Make them think that we have a weapon they can't counter. It'll buy us a few more days." Commander Holt nodded again, though his brow furrowed in concern. "And if they decide to act on it? Then we'll be ready." Eve's eyes flicked to the soldiers preparing for the worst. "We'll make them regret underestimating us." The command center hummed with a newfound energy. The plan was in motion. As Eve turned back to the terminal, she saw that the countdown had begun. The Vortherans' fleet was now only 2 days away from Earth. She had no illusions about what was to come, but one thing was certain: humanity would not go down without a fight. The first steps of the operation were set into motion, and the false intelligence was sent to their intended targets. A flicker of hope rose in Eve's chest as she watched the data transfer complete. The Vortherans would receive the information within hours, and when they did, the clock would begin ticking. But Eve wasn't finished. This was only the beginning. The next phase of the plan involved misdirection, carefully orchestrated sabotage, and psychological manipulation. The Vortherans, so sure of their superiority, would never see it coming. Eve allowed herself a brief moment of reflection as the countdown continued. She thought of her family, of all the lives that had been lost in the first wave. The Vortherans had taken everything from her. But they had underestimated one thing: the will of the human spirit. She turned away from the terminal, her voice soft yet resolute. "We're not going down without a fight. Not today. Not ever." The hearth was silent for a moment as everyone processed her words. Then, as if on cue, the team got to work. The first pieces were in motion. Humanity's last hope now rested on a single trick. A trick the Vortherans would never see coming. As the warships grew ever closer, Eve felt a surge of purpose. She wasn't just a soldier. She was humanity's last card to play. And she would play it to the end. The first wave hit hard. Eve had anticipated the Vortherans' overwhelming firepower, but seeing it in person, the sheer scale of their fleet, took her breath away. Earth's defenders, scattered remnants of military forces, had rallied together, but they were no match for the might of the invaders. The human fleet was still gathering, the majority of their forces scattered and isolated. Eve's mind raced. She had hoped to buy time, but the Vortherans were pushing forward faster than expected. Eve stood in the command center, eyes fixed on the holographic display as the enemy fleet grew larger. Her fingers tapped against the console nervously, though her face remained impassive. The countdown to their arrival was down to 24 hours, and she had yet to see any results from the misinformation that had been fed to the Vortherans. "Commander Holt," Eve said, breaking the silence. "Status update?" Holt stepped forward, his usual calm demeanor now laced with a touch of concern. "We've received a response from their forward scouts. It seems that they've started pulling their main forces into a defensive formation, as if anticipating a significant counterattack. The intel you sent them has them rattled, but they're not buying it completely. They're skeptical, but cautious." Eve's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "Good. Let them doubt. Let them second-guess themselves. That's exactly what we need." She turned back to the display. The Vortheran ships, massive and foreboding, loomed over Earth's remaining cities like a storm waiting to break. Humanity's last hope rested on a trick, one that had been planned meticulously, with every possible contingency in mind. They had to make the invaders believe in the false weapon. The key to the plan was to manipulate their pride, to convince them that humanity had discovered something that even their superior technology couldn't handle. The Vortherans, despite their might, had one fatal flaw: they were arrogant. They had crushed civilizations before and assumed that humans were no different. They didn't understand the depths of human resourcefulness. They were so sure that Earth's defenses couldn't stand up to them that they hadn't even considered the possibility that the small, vulnerable species they'd underestimated could fight back. "The second phase is ready," Eve said, turning to her team. "We've set up our decoys, communications intercepts, signal jamming, everything we need to make them believe that their intelligence is compromised. Make sure the transmission is clean and convincing. The more they doubt their own systems, the better." The team moved into action, fingers flying across consoles, sending out a series of false signals and encrypted transmissions. Eve watched them work with practiced precision. Each step of this plan had been rehearsed countless times, but there was no room for error now. If the Vortherans saw through the ruse, it could be the end. "Commander, we've received a transmission from the Vortherans," Lieutenant Harris said, his voice tight. "It's from General Zaltar's flagship. Eve's heart skipped a beat. This was it. She walked over to the screen, where the transmission was displayed in front of her. Zaltar's cold, calculating face appeared, his expression unreadable. The voice that followed was as sharp as a blade, cutting through the air with a tone of superiority. Human. You are playing a dangerous game. We are not intimidated by your empty threats. We know you have nothing but lies to offer. Eve met his gaze, her own eyes steely and unwavering. You're not as smart as you think, Zaltar. You'll see soon enough. She didn't give him a chance to respond before she terminated the communication. His arrogance was exactly what she needed. It made him blind to the threat. Holt stepped up next to her, his voice low. You think he's falling for it? I don't care if he does, Eve replied, a hint of satisfaction in her voice. The real trick is making them scramble. We're playing on their pride. They believe they've already won. If we can make them second guess, we've already won the first round. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Eve's team continued to flood the Vortheran fleet with false data, encrypted transmissions, reports of strange anomalies, and communications suggesting that Earth's so-called superweapon was already deployed and functioning. Each message was carefully crafted to look authentic, as if their intelligence was being intercepted and analyzed by multiple sources. It was the perfect setup. The more the Vortherans believed, the more they would divide their forces and spread themselves thin. At the same time, Eve ensured that Earth's fleet remained quiet, maintaining radio silence and avoiding any unnecessary movements. The human forces were weak, but they were not blind. The real fight was psychological, a battle of wits rather than firepower. By the time the Vortherans were within striking distance of Earth, Eve's plan was set in motion. The first signs of doubt began to emerge in their fleet. Communications were beginning to show signs of malfunction, and a few smaller ships had already pulled back from the front lines. The Vortherans weren't sure what to make of the anomalies, but they knew one thing for certain: they were being watched. The hunt was on. General Zaltar is splitting his fleet, Lieutenant Harris reported, his voice a mixture of surprise and caution. Some of the ships are turning back to scan the area for potential sabotage. The rest are staying on course, but there's a noticeable delay. They're not as coordinated as before. Eve's lips parted into a thin smile. The Vortherans were reacting just as expected. Doubt had crept into their ranks. It wasn't much, but it was enough to disrupt their plans. For the first time since the invasion began, Eve saw a glimmer of hope. There's more to do, Eve said, glancing over at her team. We can't afford to stop here. They'll try to regroup. When they do, we'll strike, without a weapon, without a fleet. Just pure human ingenuity. We'll make them regret underestimating us. The command center hummed with energy, but beneath the surface, there was an undercurrent of tension. The stakes were high, and time was running out. They had managed to buy themselves a few extra days, but that was all. Eve knew that the real battle was still ahead of them. She walked over to the window of the command center, staring out at the cold, barren mountains that surrounded them. Earth was in danger. But as long as she was here, she would fight. She would find a way to win, even if it meant outsmarting an entire alien empire. Prepare for the next phase, she said quietly. We'll take it one step at a time. The Vortherans haven't seen anything yet. As the clock ticked on, the world waited. Eve stood in the command center, her eyes fixed on the holographic map that stretched before her. The countdown to Earth's destruction was ticking, but her mind was miles ahead of it, weaving together the threads of the final phase of the plan. The Vortherans were only hours away from launching their final strike, yet they were still caught in the web of doubt she had carefully spun. But Eve knew the next steps had to be executed with precision. Too much was riding on this to falter now. Commander Holt, Eve said, her voice a sharp, steady rhythm. Any updates on the Vortheran fleet's movements? Holt stepped forward, his brow furrowed. They've split their forces. A significant portion of the fleet is holding back to deal with the so-called superweapon, some kind of false report they received. The rest are advancing, but with caution. They're still wary, but they don't yet realize the full scope of their own miscalculations. Eve nodded, but there was no time for relief. The operation had gone as expected so far, but the Vortherans were relentless, and they were clever. They would not remain in doubt for long. She could feel the pressure building, each second moving them closer to the tipping point. "What's the status on our own fleet?" Eve asked, turning her gaze toward the small human force scattered across the map. "Minimal activity," Holt replied. "We're keeping low, but the ships are ready to engage. No comms interference yet from the Vortherans. They're still treating us like an afterthought." "Good. That's exactly what we want." Eve's eyes narrowed. "Their arrogance is their weakness. They're assuming we'll cave under the weight of their firepower. That assumption is about to cost them everything." As if on cue, the tactical map updated with a new stream of data. Eve stepped closer, her breath steady despite the tension rising in her chest. "The Vortheran reinforcements are arriving," Holt reported, eyes scanning the screen. "It's their command ships, Zaltar's flagship is in the lead. They're converging on our position." Eve clenched her fists. This was it, the moment she had been preparing for since the first whispers of their invasion. The Vortherans had underestimated humanity at every turn, but this time, they would pay the price. "Prepare the next phase. Signal our decoys into position," she ordered. "And make sure that false transmission about the weapon reaches them one more time. I want them to think they're walking into a trap. Make them feel the weight of their own arrogance. We push them to the edge." Holt hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Understood, Captain. But are we really going to rely on this? If they push through, we'll have nothing left." "That's the beauty of it," Eve replied, her voice low and sharp. "They won't push through because they'll be too focused on their own fears. Fear is a powerful weapon, Commander." Seconds stretched into eternity as the final phase of Eve's plan unfolded. The Vortheran fleet, now divided and confused, was beginning to show signs of internal fracture. Their once unified front was slipping, as commanders began to debate their next moves, unsure whether to press forward or retreat. The seeds of doubt Eve had planted had begun to grow. Her deception was taking root. "I'm seeing movement," Lieutenant Harris announced, his voice taut with anticipation. "The Vortherans are shifting formations, retreating to secondary positions. They're spreading out, looking for the weapon, but not moving forward with the speed they once had." Eve smiled. The plan was working perfectly. "Keep pushing the intel. Tell our decoys to escalate the threat," Eve ordered. "I want them on the edge of panic. If they think they're walking into a trap, they'll waste precious time, and we can deal the final blow." As the decoys intensified the false signals, Eve's fingers moved swiftly across the terminal. She accessed the communications grid and sent one final transmission, a message that would push Zaltar and his commanders over the edge. It was a simple line of code, disguised as a legitimate report, confirming that their own forces had discovered a catastrophic weakness in the Vortheran fleet's defensive systems. The countdown had begun. But Eve wasn't done yet. She knew exactly what the Vortherans feared most: disarray. Chaos within their ranks. They had prided themselves on their superior coordination, on their ability to execute flawless strategy. But with their systems compromised and their unity fractured, the Vortherans were becoming a beast with too many heads, each pulling in a different direction. It didn't take long for the final confirmation to come in. The Vortheran flagship, Zaltar's command ship, was ordered to retreat. But it wasn't only the flagship, it was the entire fleet, slowly but surely, breaking apart at the seams. "I think we've done it," Holt said, awe creeping into his voice. "Not yet," Eve replied, her eyes hard and focused. "We'll wait until they're fully off balance. When they've scattered, we make our move." The next moments passed in a surreal, almost dreamlike state. The Vortheran fleet, once so sure of their dominance, was now in full retreat. Panic had taken root in their ranks. Zaltar, their great leader, was reduced to a shadow of his former confidence. His fleet was unraveling, and he had no idea why. Eve's heart pounded in her chest as the final act began to unfold. She keyed in the command to activate the last phase of the plan. A single, brief transmission, a simple message relayed through the interference. This is your last warning. Surrender now. It was a bluff, of course. There was no weapon. There was no magic bullet waiting to destroy the Vortherans. The trick was simple: the Vortherans had already been defeated by their own fear. And now, Eve was going to watch the result. As the final pieces fell into place, the Vortherans, distracted, disorganized, and broken, pulled back. Their fleet was in chaos, and they had no idea how to regroup. They had been so sure that they would crush humanity, and now they were scattering, retreating to try and save face. "We did it," Harris whispered, almost in disbelief. Eve allowed herself a brief moment of relief. The impossible had been achieved. Earth wasn't saved yet, but for the first time, the enemy believed they were defeated by their own hand. The arrogance of the Vortherans had led them to overlook the one thing they couldn't defeat, the human spirit. "Not yet," Eve said softly. "But it's a start." The victory was small, but it was enough. The Vortherans had underestimated humanity's ability to outthink them. The war was far from over, but Earth had just won its first battle, and Eve had made sure it would not be the last. As the enemy fleet drifted farther into the depths of space, Eve stood tall, knowing that the next phase of the war would be theirs to shape. Humanity had more tricks up its sleeve. And this fight? This fight had just begun.